Leif had been running for 6 days when the world finally ran out of ground beneath his feet. 6 days of frozen forests and half-frozen rivers, of sleeping in hollow logs and eating bark when he could not find berries, of listening to the baying of hounds grow closer with every passing hour. Jarl Sigurd's hunters were relentless, 12 of them led by a brute named Varg, who had once boasted that he had never lost a man he was tracking. Leif believed him. He had lost feeling in his toes 3 days ago, had stopped feeling hunger 2 days ago, had stopped feeling fear 1 day ago. Now all he felt was the cold and the strange, distant certainty that he was about to die. The clearing appeared without warning, the trees parting to reveal a vast open space and, beyond it, the edge of a cliff. Leif stumbled to a halt, his chest heaving, his legs trembling so badly he could barely stand. Below the cliff a river churned, black and white with rapids, its roll filling the silence. Behind him the baying of the hounds grew louder. He was trapped. He could jump and the river would kill him, drown him, smash him against the rocks, freeze him before he could reach the far shore. Or he could stay, and Varg would kill him slower. He had burned the documents 3 days ago, the proof of Sigurd's crimes reduced to ashes that still clung to his shirt. The truth was in his head now, and no amount of torture could extract it whole. But Varg would try anyway. He always tried. The trees rustled, and Varg emerged from the darkness like a wolf stepping out of a nightmare. He was a massive man, bold and scarred, with fingers that seemed too long for his hands and a smile that never reached his eyes. Behind him, 12 warriors fanned out, torches in their hands, axes on their hips. The hounds strained at their leashes, foam dripping from their jaws. "Nowhere left to run, scribe," Varg said, his voice thick with satisfaction. He walked toward Leif slowly, savoring the moment, his boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. "You have led us on a merry chase. I will give you that. But all chases end the same way. The rabbit tires. The wolf eats." He stalked a few feet from Leif, close enough that Leif could smell the blood on his clothes. Not his blood, not yet, but someone's. "Give me the documents, and I will make your death quick." A slash across the throat. No pain, no fear. "Refuse, and I will make it last for days. I will take you apart piece by piece, and you will beg me to finish you, and I will not." Leif's hand went to his chest, where the ashes of the documents were still pressed against his heart. "They are gone," he said, and his voice was steadier than he had expected. "I burned them 3 nights ago. The truth is in my head now, and you cannot cut it out of me. You can kill me, Varg, but you cannot make me forget, and you cannot make Sigurd innocent." Varg's smile faded. His hand went to the axe at his belt, and his knuckles went white around the haft. "Then I will cut something else out of you," he said, "piece by piece, starting with your tongue." He raised the axe. Leif closed his eyes. He thought of the home he had lost, the family he had left behind, the life that had been stolen from him. He thought of all the things he would never do, never see, never feel. And then a voice spoke from the darkness behind Varg, a voice so cold, so deep, so utterly without fear that it seemed to freeze the very air. "You will not touch him." Every head turned. From the shadows at the edge of the clearing, a figure emerged, a man so large that he seemed to block out the stars behind him. He was not young. His hair was streaked with silver, and his face was carved with the scars of 100 battles, old wounds that had healed into white lines across his cheeks and forehead. But his shoulders were broad as an ox's yoke, and his eyes, gray as winter iron, cold as the deep sea, held a power that made even Varg take a step back. Jarl Hagen the Iron Fist, the most feared chieftain in the northern lands, the man who had never protected anyone. "Jarl Hagen," Varg said, and his voice had lost some of its confidence. He lowered his axe, though he did not sheath it. "This man is a fugitive. He stole from Jarl Sigurd. He is not your concern." Hagen walked past Varg as if he were not there. He walked past the warriors, past the hounds, past the torches and the drawn weapons. He walked until he stood directly in front of Leif, his massive body blocking the scribe from the edge of the cliff and from Varg's raised axe. Then he turned to face the hunting party, and when he spoke, his voice carried through the clearing like a blade being drawn from a sheath. "You are under my protection now," Hagen said, and every word was a hammer blow, a declaration of war, a promise carved in stone. "Anyone who touches him touches me. Anyone who wants to kill him must kill me first." The silence that followed was absolute. The hounds stopped baying. The warriors stopped breathing. Varg's face went pale, then red, then pale again. Hagen the Iron Fist, who had never lifted a finger to save anyone, who had watched men die in front of him without blinking, who had built his reputation on the simple truth that he did not care, was claiming a stranger as his own. "You cannot be serious," Varg said, his voice rising. "He is nothing to you. He is a southerner, a scribe, a thief. He is under my protection," Hagen repeated, and his voice did not change. It was still cold, still steady, still absolute. "My answer will not change, no matter how many times you ask. Leave this place or stay and die. The choice is yours." Varg stared at Hagen for a long moment. His hand trembled on his axe. His warriors looked to him for guidance, fear and confusion written on their faces. Then slowly he lowered his weapon entirely. "This is not over," he said, the words tasting like defeat. "Jarl Sigurd will hear of this. He will not forget. He will not forgive." "I am counting on it," Hagen said. Varg turned and stalked back toward the trees, gesturing for his men to follow. The hounds whined, confused, but they obeyed. Within moments the clearing was empty except for Hagen and Leif. The torches disappeared into the forest, the sound of hooves faded into the distance, and the only light came from the stars and the pale glow of the moon. Leif's legs gave out. He collapsed against the cliff edge, his whole body shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps that fogged in the cold air. His hands were bleeding from where he had scraped them on rocks during his flight. His lips were cracked and blue, his eyes were hollow with exhaustion. Hagen did not move to help him. He simply stood there, looking down at Leif with those cold gray eyes, his expression unreadable. "Why?" Leif whispered, the word barely audible over the roar of the river below. "You do not know me. You have never met me. You have no reason to risk your life for a stranger. Why would you do this?" Hagen was silent for a long moment. The wind stirred his silver-streaked hair, and the starlight caught the scars on his face, making them seem to glow. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost soft, a tone that no one in the northern lands had ever heard from him. "Because you did not beg," he said. "Because you stood at the edge of a cliff with death behind you and death below you, and you did not beg, you did not plead. You did not offer him gold or secrets or your silence in exchange for your life. You just stood there and you waited and you were ready to die." He paused, and something flickered in his gray eyes, something that looked almost like pain. I have not seen that in a long time. I had forgotten that people could be that brave. He extended his hand, palm up, fingers steady. "Now get up. We have a long walk to my hole, and you look like you will collapse before we reach the tree line. I do not want to carry you, but I will if I have to." Leif stared at the offered hand. It was scarred, calloused, the hand of a killer. The knuckles were misshapen from old breaks, and the fingers were stained with ink and blood and something darker. But it was steady, it was warm, and it was the first hand that had reached out to him in 6 days. He took it. Hagen's grip was strong, almost too strong, and he pulled Leif to his feet as if he weighed nothing. For a moment, they stood face to face, close enough that Leif could see the individual lines of the scars on Hagen's cheeks, the flecks of gold in his gray eyes, the way his breath misted in the cold air. Then Hagen turned and began to walk toward the trees, and Leif followed. He did not have a choice. But for the first time in 6 days, he did not feel like he was running. The walk to Hagen's hole took 3 hours through dense forests and across frozen streams. Leif stumbled every few hundred yards, his body screaming for rest, his vision blurring at the edges. Each time he staggered, Hagen caught him, not gently, not tenderly, but firmly, his massive hand gripping Leif's arm and keeping him upright. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the frost, the distant howl of a wolf, and Leif's own ragged breathing. When they finally reached the gates of the fortress, the guards stared in disbelief. Hagen had never brought anyone to his hole. He had never invited a guest, never taken a lover, never shown an ounce of softness to anyone in the 20 years he had ruled. He was the Iron Fist, cold and alone, a mountain that no one could climb and no one wanted to. But here he was, supporting a half-dead stranger with his own arm, and no one dared ask questions. The guards opened the gates, and Hagen led Leif through the longhouse, past the warriors who stopped mid-drink to stare, past the thralls who whispered behind their hands, past the great hearth where the fire burned low and red. He stopped at a door at the far end of the hall, a door made of dark oak banded with iron, and pushed it open. Inside was a bedchamber, simple, sparse, but warm, with a bed piled high with furs and a fire already crackling in the hearth. A sword hung on the wall above the bed, its blade etched with runes that Leif could not read. A shield leaned against the far wall, dented and scarred from countless battles. The room smelled of leather and pine and old smoke. "This is my room," Hagen said, stepping aside to let Leif enter. "You will sleep here tonight." Leif's eyes widened. He looked at the bed, then at Hagen, then back at the bed. "Where will you sleep?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I do not sleep much," Hagen said. His expression was still unreadable, but there was something in his voice. A weariness, perhaps, or a sadness, that made Leif's chest ache. "Lie down. Rest. Tomorrow we will talk. Tonight you need to sleep." Leif was too exhausted to argue. He stumbled to the bed and collapsed onto the furs, not bothering to remove his boots or his coat. The furs were soft, softer than anything he had felt in weeks, and the warmth of the fire seeped into his frozen bones. He closed his eyes, and the darkness swallowed him before his head hit the pillow. He did not dream. He did not stir. But sometime in the depths of the night, he woke just enough to see a figure sitting by the window, silhouette against the pale light of the moon. Hagen sat with his back to the wall, his sword across his knees, his eyes fixed on the door, watching, waiting, watching over him. Leif did not know why the sight made his throat tighten. He did not know why his eyes filled with tears. He only knew that, for the first time in 6 days, he felt safe. He closed his eyes and slept more deeply than he had in years. The weeks that followed were strange and tense, a careful dance between two men who did not know how to trust and did not know how to stay. Hagen gave Leif clean clothes, simple wool tunics and leather boots that fit surprisingly well. He gave Leif good food, roasted meat and dark bread and fresh water from the well. He gave Leif a small room of his own, not the great hall, not the dungeons, but a real room with a window that looked out over the sea. He did not ask Leif about the documents. He did not ask about Sigurd. He did not ask about the past or the future or anything that might cause pain. He simply protected. When Sigurd's emissaries came to demand Leif's return, Hagen stood in the great hall with his hand on his sword and his grey eyes fixed on theirs, and he told them to leave or die. They left, but they promised to return. When a group of warriors loyal to Sigurd tried to sneak into the fortress at night, Hagen's guards intercepted them and threw them into the dungeons, and Hagen personally questioned each one before sending their heads back to Sigurd in a sack. When one of Hagen's own men, a grizzled veteran named Ornolf, who had served the Jarl for 15 years, grumbled that Leif was a liability, a danger to them all, a southerner who would bring nothing but trouble, Hagen looked at him with those cold grey eyes and said, "He is under my protection. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with my axe." Ornolf never complained again. Leif watched all of this with growing confusion and a strange, unwelcome warmth in his chest. He did not understand why Hagen was protecting him. He did not understand why the Jarl had not asked for anything in return, not the truth about Sigurd, not a favor, not even a thank you. He did not understand why, when their eyes met across the great hall, something warm flickered in the Jarl's cold gaze, something that looked almost like longing. One night, unable to sleep, Leif walked through the silent longhouse and found Hagen sitting alone in the empty hall, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The Jarl looked old in the dim light, tired and worn, the weight of his years pressing down on his shoulders. His silver-streaked hair was disheveled, and his scarred face was softened by exhaustion. He did not look like the Iron Fist. He looked like a man who had been alone for too long. "You should be resting," Leif said, sitting down on the bench across from him. The wood creaked beneath his weight. "So should you," Hagen replied without looking up. "But neither of us seems capable of it. The night has a way of keeping the restless awake." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackle of the embers and the distant crash of the waves against the cliffs far below the fortress. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the runes on the swords seem to move. Then Leif asked the question that had been burning in his mind for days. "Why are you doing this?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have no reason to protect me. I am a stranger. I am a liability. I'm a target. Everything you have built, your alliances, your safety, your life, you have put at risk for me. Why?" Hagen was silent for a long moment. His gray eyes were fixed on the embers, watching them fade from orange to red to gray. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost soft, a tone that no one in the northern lands had ever heard from him. "I was not always the Iron Fist," he said. 20 years ago, I was someone else, someone softer, someone who believed in honor and loyalty and the kindness of strangers." He paused, and his hand tightened on his knee. "I had a family, a wife, a daughter. They were killed by a rival Jarl who wanted my lands. I was not there to protect them. I was away, fighting someone else's war, earning someone else's favor." His voice cracked on the last word, and Leif's heart clenched. "I spent years hunting the man who killed them. I found him. Eventually, I killed him slowly, the way he had killed my family, and when it was done, I had nothing left. No family, no home, no reason to be anything except what I became." He looked up, and his gray eyes met Leif's. "I became the Iron Fist. I stopped protecting people because protecting people meant losing them. I stopped caring because caring meant pain. I built walls around myself, and I let no one in." His gaze dropped to the fire again. "And then I saw you, standing at the edge of that cliff, too tired to run, too proud to beg, and I saw myself. I saw the man I had been before the walls, before the pain, before the iron, and I could not walk away. I could not let you die." Leif's throat was so tight he could barely breathe. He rose from the bench and crossed the space between them, his footsteps soft on the stone floor. He knelt in front of Hagen, not in submission, not in fear, but in gratitude, in understanding, in something deeper that he did not yet have words for. "You are not the Iron Fist," Leif said softly, looking up into the Jarl's scarred face. Not to me. You are just a man who has been alone for too long. And I am just a man who has been running for too long. Perhaps we can stop running together." Hagen reached out with a hand that trembled, the hand that had killed 100 men, that had held an axe through 1,000 battles, and touched Leif's face. His fingers were rough, calloused, scarred, but they were gentle. They traced the line of Leif's jaw, the curve of his cheek, the softness of his lips. "I have not touched anyone in 20 years, Hagen whispered, his voice breaking. "I have not wanted to. I have not dared to, but I want to touch you. I want to hold you. I want to protect you, not because I swore an oath, but because I choose to, because you make me want to be the man I was before." Leif covered Hagen's hand with his own, pressing it against his cheek. His skin was warm, and his heart was pounding, and he was terrified and hopeful and overwhelmed all at once. "Then protect me," he said, "and let me protect you in return. Not as a Jarl and a fugitive, not as the Iron Fist and the Scribe, as two men who have been alone for too long and do not want to be alone anymore." Hagen pulled him close, his massive arms wrapping around Leif's slender frame, and held him as if he were the most precious thing in the world. They sat together in the darkness, the fire dying beside them, the stars fading overhead, and they did not speak. There was nothing left to say. Everything that mattered had already been said. Sigurd did not wait long to strike. A month after Leif had arrived at Hagen's fortress, the Jarl of the northern marshes launched a full-scale attack. Not a raid, not a skirmish, a war. He had gathered his allies, his warriors, his ships, and he had come to crush Hagen and anyone who dared protect his enemy. The attack came at dawn, the sun still hidden behind the eastern mountains, the world still gray and cold. The sentries sounded the alarm just as the first wave of Sigurd's warriors crashed against the gates, their axes gleaming, their war cries splitting the air. Hagen fought like a demon. His axe, the same weapon that had killed the man who murdered his family, carved through the enemy ranks with a fury that made even his own warriors step back. His voice roared commands above the din of battle, directing his men to the weak points, calling for reinforcements, refusing to yield an inch of ground. But Sigurd had more men, better positions, and the advantage of surprise. The defenders were being pushed back, inch by bloody inch, toward the great hole. Leif watched from the wall, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He could not fight. He had never been trained to hold a sword, had never even held an axe. His hands were made for holding pens and parchment, not weapons. But he could not stand by and do nothing while Hagen bled for him. He ran, not away from the battle, toward it. He ran to the longhouse, to the small room where he had been hiding the letters he had secretly sent to the other chieftains. For weeks, he had been writing to the Jarls that Sigurd had wronged, the ones whose lands had been stolen, whose families had been killed, whose trust had been betrayed. He had told them the truth about Sigurd's crimes, the same truth that had forced him to flee. He had asked for their help, not for his own sake, but for the sake of justice. He had not known if any of them would come. He had not dared to hope. But as he reached the longhouse, he heard it, a horn, low and mournful, echoing from the forest beyond the fortress walls. Then another horn, then another. And then the ground shook with the thunder of hooves. Sigurd's warriors paused, looking around in confusion, their axes half raised, their war cries dying on their lips. From the trees, a new army emerged. Not Sigurd's, not Hagen's, but the warriors of the clans that Sigurd had betrayed. They had come. They had answered Leif's call. The tide of battle turned in an instant. Sigurd's forces, caught between Hagen's defenders and the new arrivals, crumbled like a sandcastle beneath a wave. They threw down their weapons, raised their hands, surrendered, and in the chaos, Sigurd himself tried to flee. Hagen caught him at the gate. The two Jarls faced each other, axes raised, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The battle continued around them, the clash of steel, the screams of the wounded, the shouts of the victors. But Hagen and Sigurd were still, frozen in their own private war. "You protected a traitor," Sigurd spat, his face twisted with rage, his eyes wild with defeat. "You threw away everything for a scribe who means nothing. Your reputation, your alliances, your safety, all of it, for a man who cannot even hold a sword. You are a fool, Hagen." Hagen looked at Sigurd, and something in his cold gray eyes softened, not with pity, with certainty. "He is not nothing," Hagen said, his voice steady, calm, absolute. "He is the man who showed me that I was not nothing. He is the man who reminded me that protecting someone is not a burden, it is a gift. It is the only thing that has ever given my life meaning." He raised his axe, and the runes on the blade caught the morning light. "And I will protect him until my last breath, not because I owe him anything, because I love him." Sigurd's eyes went wide. "Love?" He scoffed. "You love a southerner, a scribe?" He never finished the sentence. Hagen's axe came down, not on Sigurd's neck, but on his sword, shattering the blade and sending the pieces flying. The impact knocked Sigurd to the ground, and before he could rise, two of Hagen's guards were on him, pinning his arms behind his back. "Take him away," Hagen said to his guards. "He will stand trial for his crimes. The clans he wronged deserve to see him answer for what he has done." He turned away from Sigurd without another word, without a backward glance. He had no interest in gloating. He had no interest in revenge. He had only one thought in his mind. Leif. He found the scribe standing on the wall, the bow that he had somehow managed to fire still trembling in his hands. There was an arrow missing from the quiver at his feet. Only one. It had flown wild, nowhere near Sigurd, nowhere near any enemy, but it had been enough. It had been a signal, a cry for help, a declaration that Leif was not just a bystander in his own rescue. Hagen climbed the steps to the wall, his boots heavy on the stone, his breath still ragged from the battle. When he reached the top, Leif turned to face him. The scribe's face was streaked with ash and tears. His hands were bleeding from the bowstring, his eyes were red from exhaustion and lack of sleep. But he was alive. He was alive, and he was looking at Hagen as if the Jarl were the sun and the moon and the stars all rolled into one. "You shot an arrow," Hagen said. "I missed," Leif said, and his voice cracked. "I was aiming at the sky." Hagen laughed. It was not a loud laugh, not a mocking laugh. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated relief, the first laugh he had laughed in 20 years. "Come here," he said. "I want to kiss you." Leif dropped the bow and walked into Hagen's arms. Their lips met, there on the wall, with the battle still smoldering below them, and the sun finally rising over the mountains. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate and hungry and full of all the words they had not said, all the fears they had not voiced, all the hopes they had not dared to hold. When they finally broke apart, both of them were crying. "I love you," Hagen said, his voice rough, broken, beautiful. "I have loved you since the moment I saw you at the edge of that cliff. I was too afraid to say it. I thought loving someone would make me weak. I thought protecting someone would cost me everything. But you have taught me that love is not weakness. It is the only strength that matters." Leif cupped Hagen's scarred face in his hands, his fingers tracing the lines of old wounds, the curves of the jowl's jaw, the softness of his lips. "I love you too," he said. "I love you, Hagen. And I am not running anymore. I am not hiding anymore. I am staying with you forever." They kissed again, and the cheers of the warriors rose up around them, not for the battle, not for the victory, but for them, for the Iron Fist who had learned to love, for the scribe who had learned to stay, for the two men who had found each other in the darkness and had chosen, against all odds, to protect each other. The years that followed were not easy. Sigurd was tried and executed, and his allies scattered like ashes in the wind. Hagen's reputation changed, no longer the Iron Fist cold and alone, but the Jarl who protected, the man who had risked everything for a stranger and had found love in return. Leif became his closest advisor, his partner, his heart. They ruled together, not as Jarl and subject, but as equals. They built a new kind of fortress, one not just of stone and iron, but of trust and respect and the quiet, steady certainty that they would never be alone again. On the anniversary of the day they met, Hagen and Leif stood on the wall where they had first kissed, looking out at the sea. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and the waves crashed against the cliffs below like a heartbeat. "Do you remember the first thing you said to me?" Leif asked, leaning his head on Hagen's shoulder. "You said, 'You are under my protection now.' I thought you were mad. I thought you were trying to get yourself killed." Hagen wrapped his arm around Leif's waist and pulled him close. "I was mad," he said, pressing a kiss to Leif's hair. "Mad with fear, mad with desperation, mad with the sudden, terrifying realization that I could not let you die, that I would rather die myself than watch you fall." He tilted Leif's chin up and looked into his eyes, those warm, intelligent eyes that had seen so much pain and still found room for hope. "And I was right, because you saved me, Leif. You saved me from a life of loneliness and fear. You saved me from myself." Leif smiled, the same smile that had first cracked the ice around Hagen's heart all those months ago. "And you saved me from an arrow that I was definitely not aiming at Sigurd's head." Hagen laughed. "You are a terrible shot, but I am a terrible shot who loves you. That is all that matters." They kissed, slow and deep, and the sun sank below the horizon, and the stars came out one by one. Hagen, the Iron Fist who had never protected anyone, had found someone worth protecting. Leif, the scribe who had spent his whole life running, had found someone worth staying for. They had claimed each other, not with chains, not with oaths, not with the cold certainty of power, but with a dangerous promise that had changed everything. "You are under my protection now," Hagen had said, and Leif had stayed, and they had both lived and loved and never looked back.